So, welcome back again to We Don't Have Time, broadcasting here from COP29 in Baku from our climate hub on the wonderful Caspian Sea. It's getting to be crunch time here at this UN climate conference. Tomorrow is supposed to be the final day. Actually, that's not correct. It's actually Friday is supposed to be the final day. And of course, the shuttle diplomacy going on very much between the G20 meeting in Brazil and the negotiators here meeting in Azerbaijan on how the money needed for developing countries to actually move forward with their national climate plans can actually be realized. So people are talking about 1 trillion a year. Let's see what happens. It's very complex right now. While they do that, and that's very important, we do what we do, and we will continue to bring a number of interesting voices from many sectors and many countries in today's broadcast. Today, we will invite leading climate scientist, Professor Johan Rockström, to our broadcast to talk about the state of the planet, a new documentary, the need for sharp business and national transition plans, and also about methane and other short-lived climate pollutants. What can we do with those to actually turbocharge a response to the climate emergency? This is one of very few events Johan Rockström is attending at this COP, and so we're very happy to have him here on our broadcast and that he could find time. And talking about methane, I suppose we're quite happy to share the great news that was announced on the broadcast yesterday that countries representing nearly 50% of global methane emissions from organic waste, you can think of food waste, farming waste, all kinds of things, have pledged to reduce these emissions. This is indeed good news, but pledges also need to be carried through by action. And that's why we need bold science and we need bold policy. And we also need that money to be raised for the developing world so they can do their part as well. We're now going to hear from two very interesting voices on the methane story because this is Buy More Time at We Don't Have Time. This is our regular show and these are pre-recorded interviews with two fascinating people. First up is an interview with Baroness Sheehan. She's a member of the House of Lords in the United Kingdom. And she came to our studio a few days ago to share with us what she is hoping to do with the methane story in the UK and also, in a sense, around the world. And right after this, we will now an interview with Steve Hamburg. He's he's one of my new heroes, actually, because he's the chief scientist at the Environmental Defence Fund and the project lead of MethaneSat, and which you remember is this amazing new satellite to join other satellites up there that can actually see in real time methane pouring out of oil and gas installations, waste tips and other sources, including agriculture. And they're working on even more funky stuff, like new satellites can actually image carbon dioxide coming out of various parts of the planet. So remember, if you agree that rapidly cutting methane emissions is important, which, my God, how can you not be thinking it's important after all our shows, then please go right now to wedon'thavetime.org/buymore-time. Buy more time. wedon'thavetime.org/buymore-time to join hundreds of others in signing a letter to your country's UN ambassador to take action right now, right here, and at speed and at scale on methane emissions in their countries. Now, let's watch those interviews that I just flagged. Let's move on. So we have another wonderful guest with us here in the We Don't Have Time studios in Baku at COP29 on the wonderful Caspian Sea. It's Baroness Sheehan, and she's chair of the House of Lords Environment and Climate Change Committee in the United Kingdom. Tell us a little bit about your work and particularly this focus that's now coming on methane.
Excellent. Yes, methane is a subject very close to my heart at the moment. We have spent several months looking at detail into methane. on the domestic front as well as on the global stage as well, to see the difference that bearing down on methane emissions can make. And what we've found out, I think, is something that needs to be broadcast far and wide, and our reports will be published in about 2 weeks' time. We hope to carry on from the momentum after COP29 on why it's so important to deal with methane.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because, I mean, the science has been around for donkey's years, but it seems like, you know, like everything in life, sometimes it has, at the moment arrives. Why do you think that is with methane?
I think that's such a good question. I think for a while we've been concentrating on carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is responsible for, you know, we've got about 1.3 Celsius of warming at the moment. 0.8 of that is attributed to carbon dioxide, but a whopping 0.5 Celsius is attributed to methane. And I don't think that's fully appreciated, how potent a greenhouse gas methane is compared to carbon dioxide. So for ton, methane will give you a global warming 80 times greater than carbon dioxide. It's smaller in it's present in smaller proportions, which is great. And the thing to take away from methane is that it is short-lived. It's carbon dioxide can stay in the atmosphere for a couple of thousand years. Methane is more or less done its damage in the first 10-12 years of its lifetime in the environment, and after that it peters away. So if we can bear down on methane emissions early and rapidly, then we can really slow global warming. I think there's some information in the report where Professor Piers Forster, who's the interim chair of the Climate Change Committee, which oversees the UK's delivery of our net zero target, says that, you know, in the next couple of decades, we can, if we bear down on methane, we can stop the rate of cooling from 0.25 Celsius per decade to 0.1 Celsius per decade. We can buy time if we act early.
Buy more time.
We can buy more time, absolutely. And that's why it's so important that we really try and bear down and spread the awareness, because this is a message of hope. And that's what we need. It's not as though there's nothing that we can do.
It's a golden opportunity, really, for this sprint that we could undertake. I mean, the International Energy Agency says, for example, that the oil and gas industry could actually or should reduce their emissions of methane by 75%. There will be no cost for doing this, and all the technology is known. I mean, I think agriculture is a bit more complex politically. But certainly oil and gas industry, waste and landfills all around the world emitting methane. And of course we have these new satellites that it's like there's nowhere to hide. You can actually see it pouring out of various installations around the world. Yeah,
so let's start with oil and gas, because it's such low-hanging fruit. I think Stephen Hamburg, Professor Stephen Hamburg, who's with the EDF, his sentence remains with me when he gave testimony to our committee, and he said that, you know, oil and gas, the methane that comes out from there, he says it's not low-hanging fruit, it's fruit lying on the ground. Yeah, let's just get on and do it. And it is a large proportion. Agriculture and the oil and the energy sector are on a par, actually, with their global contribution to methane. And certainly with, as you say, with the oil and gas industry, it is such a no-brainer, because, as you say, the technology is well known. We just have to grab it. We just have to capture that methane that's currently spewing out of those flaring and venting chimneys. You know, those dreadful things causing dreadful pollution as well. You know, we can capture that methane. It has a value. It's natural gas. It's what fires a lot of the cookers, the gas cookers and gas boilers, etc. It has economic value, and the fact that the industry are unable to take that opportunity because they are resistant to change. This is just the way they've always done it, and even though there's economic value, they have to be, I think, once they have to be made. to walk the walk here.
So right now, as you may know, in the United States, Canada, and increasing numbers of countries, even Nigeria and now Kazakhstan, looking at it, regulations, and then the European Union has these regulations, as I'm sure you're aware, which is on if you bring gas or export gas into the EU, that you have to somehow demonstrate that you're cutting the methane losses, you might say, from your operations. Your select committee, your report will go to the government, I presume.
It goes directly to the government.
Yeah.
The government has to respond, make an official response to that report, and the report will be debated on the floor of the House of Lords, and we hope that the message will go out far and wide.
Right. So you're hoping that the UK government, which is being quite ambitious now with its new national climate plan, its new nationally determined contribution of plus 80%, might look at this report and say, okay, maybe there's something in this to assist the UK, to its very ambitious target.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the UK hasn't. The UK was so instrumental in getting the global methane pledge signed and really successful, because it was launched at COP26, which of course the UK hosted. Alok Sharma was the president of the COP then, and I think he personally has invested a great deal into getting the global methane pledge launched. But since then, we haven't done as much, I don't think, on the global stage as we could have done in the UK, because we have a fantastic story to tell. We've been so successful in reducing methane emissions for various reasons. We're down by about over 60%. It's quite something, actually. And so it's just getting that message out there and saying to this government, look, there are things that you haven't done, like you haven't published the UK Methane Action Plan. It would be great to have that published with proper detail on how we reduce emissions by sector, agriculture, oil and gas, and waste, of course, landfill. That's a large proportion of the methane gas.
Yes. Lastly, there are other short-lived super pollutants. Some are a bit more long-lived than short-lived, but they're all more short-lived than carbon dioxide, so I suppose we put them in the same bracket in some shape or form. Dealing with these, I mean, you mentioned before the great success, we were just chatting before, of the Montreal Protocol with fluorinated gases that used to be in our fridges and cooling systems and things like that. Is there an argument to at least discuss and consider some kind of protocol for these other short-lived pollutants, like, for example, nitrous oxide, which is a very strong global warming gas, of course, along with methane?
Indeed, and I'm so glad you brought up the Montreal Protocol, which in the late 80s was a huge success. And it was a success because the ozone hole was visible from space. We knew what caused it, we knew what to do to stop it. The world came together and acted as one. And where there's that political will and leadership and determination to solve a problem, the world can do it. So I have great hope that we can do this again at climate change. We're at a point, I think, where we can see what is happening. There is no longer any doubt, any room for any doubt that climate change is here with us and accelerating. It really is. We're hurtling towards the 1.5 and then possibly the 2.
Yes, we can't let that happen.
We can't let that happen,
absolutely.
and we know what to do. We have the model for Montreal Protocol. Why not apply it? It's a no-brainer to these other short-lived but extremely potent greenhouse gases. Whose concentrations are increasing, and this is something that we have to take away. We know the damage these things are doing, and yet the concentration of methane, nitrous oxide, the HFCs, etc., are going up.
Thank you very much indeed, Baroness. That was very enlightening, and best of luck with your work.
Thank you very much, Nick.
So I'm absolutely delighted to have with me here Stephen Hamburg, who's the chief scientist with the NGO EDF, the Environmental Defence Fund, and basically the sort of linchpin of this wonderful new methane satellite, MethaneSat, and a very distinguished scientist in his own right for many, many years. And It's super to have you here, and methane has been a bit of a thing for us broadcasting here. Every day we have a methane show called Buy More Time, and it seems that methane's getting a lot of traction, but it's probably going to get more traction with good data, and you've just released some data on this MethaneSat and what it can actually do. Tell us a little bit about what you're finding.
So what we're able to show is that for the first time we can measure and quantify methane emissions at a scale and at a level of precision and detail that we've never had before. So that really gives us an ability to understand methane emissions, where they're occurring across the globe. In our case, we're initially starting to look at the oil and gas industry. We'll also do agriculture, and allow us to, for the first time, get direct measurements, empirical data, across the entire industry, across the entire globe, and be able to really have solid evidence of who's performing well and who's not, and how are things changing over time. I like to say it allows us to answer three basic questions. Where are the emissions? How much are the emissions? And how much are changing over time? We've never had that data directly for any greenhouse gas for an entire industry, full stop.
Amazing. Why, in your view, is action on methane absolutely critical, particularly at this moment?
Because methane is responsible for almost 30% of the warming that we experience. And unlike CO2, which persists for centuries and millennia, methane's in the atmosphere only for a decade or so. So if we reduce methane emissions, we see the positive impact on the climate very quickly. And what we know is that there are lots of opportunities to reduce those methane emissions. We can dramatically reduce methane with existing technology, and much of it at little to no net cost. So we have this huge lever that we didn't even know existed a decade ago, that now we can pull down on and start to put the brakes on the rate of warming that's occurring, which will have enormous positive benefits for humanity and the natural world.
So Buy More Time is not a bad slogan.
It's not a bad slogan.
Yeah.
We do need to remember that we need to both work on the short-lived climate pollutants like methane at the same time as we do double and triple down on decarbonization. We have two climate problems. We got to solve both of them. But the tools to solve them are different. They're related, but different.
You were chatting to me just before we started this interview that perhaps in the past we made a little error on somehow equating methane to its warming impact like CO2. Just explain that. That's a bit complex, but I think it's worth just pointing out.
Yeah, so in order to try and make the problem simpler, there was an agreement to use a 100-year time frame for all the greenhouse gases. But in fact, what turns out is that we have different greenhouse gases that affect us over the next few decades than the ones that affect us over the long term. When we put them together, it undervalues reductions of short-lived climate pollutants like methane, which is the dominant one, but also black carbon and others, aerosols. And what we end up doing is losing opportunities to slow the warming because we didn't recognize how important they were to the overall problem.
Right.
When we start to look at it at different time scales, we discover, in fact, we have more levers of impact, more opportunities than we realized. We just simply blinded ourselves to some of those, which was unfortunate. It was not deliberate, it wasn't malicious in any way, but it was unfortunate.
Right. So now things have changed. It seems here at COP29 and also last year at COP28, but I think particularly here, the policymakers seem to have internalized this, and let's call it an opportunity.
It's a revolution.
Yeah, it's a revolution and an opportunity for us to move, to sprint right now, and perhaps even through the lens of acting on methane, have a chance of halving emissions by 2030.
Yeah, well, we should think about it as what the rate of warming is really the measure. We do that, we talk about halving emissions. What we really want to do is slow the rate of warming, which we need to reduce emissions greatly, but we need to remember that the quantitative changes for methane and CO2 are not going to be the same. And let's pull down on these levers, both of them, and think about them as what's going to happen in the next decade. I like to think about it, what's going to happen in the rest of my lifetime? Methane's going to dominate. And what's going to happen in the rest of my daughter's lifetime? CO2 will be more important. When we think about it that way, we really do have this power this revolution that we can take advantage of. And the good news is we know how to do it, as I said before. I can't emphasize that enough.
Yep.
And the impacts of just doing what we know how to do are really large.
And for the first time for a while, the oil and gas industry have been given an open invite to do something positive. The question, I suppose, is, will they? And, you know, there have been some readings in the last, 12 months where a certain place, certain leaks have been seen coming every month or something like that. I read a report or whatever. And those responsible for the leaks have been informed about it, but so far they haven't done anything. So how do we make sure that the oil and gas industry and waste management and the other areas where methane comes from actually do or act on the information from MethaneSat?
Well, I think the key here is that we provide comprehensive data that just absolutely clear where the sources are coming from in a way we've never had before. We currently have data for individual spots, and it's a little harder to make the case about how much you're emitting. What we're seeing in a lot of the data, not all of it, but much of it, is that the emissions are much higher than are being reported. So here, we no longer have to rely on reporting, we're directly measuring. This is why it's such a revolution. Almost all the greenhouse gases are calculated, not measured. We're for the first time going to measure the emissions from an entire industry, report them publicly, totally transparently, and that will allow everyone to see who are the good actors. And lots of people are making lots of claims about how well they're doing, and some are probably correct, but many of them are not.
Yeah.
We will for the first time be able to hold people to account. Reward them, those who are really doing a good job, but also hold those who aren't to the task of meeting their obligations that they committed to. We can now do that with the data we're going to have.
So I think I mentioned we have a daily show on methane. This is a short interview with you that will be part of our overall broadcast. But we did want to invite the oil and gas industry onto our shows. And I did talk to several of them, especially those associations that have been created, like the Oil and Gas Climate Initiative, for example. And they were like, well, we'd like to, but we don't feel we're quite ready to talk publicly. And I feel that they've probably been a bit surprised by MethaneSat. I think they've probably been surprised also by the data that shows, as you say, that actually there's more methane coming out than we actually realized before. Not that that's a bad thing in itself. It'd be good if it wasn't happening, but it means now we have better baselines from which to actually measure success, yeah?
Absolutely. There's no substitute for empirical data. Now, I'm a scientist, so I believe in empirical data, but I also think it's the clarity of it. And remember that last year, the Oil and Gas Decarbonization Charter, which is more than 50 companies that produce almost half the oil and gas in the world, made commitments to bring their emissions to very low levels. And other companies have committed. So the key here is we have commitments, and now we'll have the tools to actually directly measure whether those commitments are being met.
Right.
This is really quite dramatic, I believe. The reason we invested in building MethaneSat is we thought that having such data was critical if we're going to really realize the kinds of actions that are necessary to slow the rate of warming. In the past, you know, calculations, there has to be a lot of trust, as a common saying, right? Trust but verify. We wanted to add the verify to that expression because we did not have that before.
So we're just probably like a minute and a half. Couple of things. Will MethaneSat then mean that those NGOs that go around with the kind of handheld detectors are out of work, or do you still need those people?
No, you need them at different scales. So we're going to create the big picture. We're going to have we're going to be able to map it, quantify the total, say where the hotspots are, but we won't have the detailed data for every individual point.
Right.
And that's all added. This is a team sport, right? It's not one tool that can do everything. We believe this was an important gap in our knowledge, but we need people on the ground. We need their different satellites, the satellite communities working together in a way that it never has to create a really integrated product. I work with the International Methane Emissions Observatory at the UN Environment Program that brings all the data together so you'll have one-stop shopping. We've never had that for greenhouse gases before. We've never had one place you can go and see everything that we know about a greenhouse gas and its emissions. It's still getting built, but these are amazing developments. I'm really optimistic that we are bringing the tools to bear to do the hard work that needs to be done and do it rapidly. Do we have the work still to do? Absolutely. But the levers are now visible, and we realize how big they are, and we got to collectively hold on to them and pull down on them and really get movement.
Yeah. Last question. Can it detect methane from coal mines?
It can detect methane from coal mines, from agriculture and waste. So when we built MethaneSat, we decided to do one thing as well as we possibly could, which was look at oil and gas related methane emissions. But we can do other things. We are working with the New Zealand Space Agency, and that's allowing us, they're developing a whole program around agriculture, and they'll use MethaneSat for that. We just looked, on Saturday when I announced some of the data releases, one of the areas in Appalachia, which produce a lot of gas, also has a lot of coal, and we showed areas which was the methane was coming from coal, areas it was coming from oil and gas, mainly gas in that case, coming from landfills. So we can look at all of it, but we also have to make sure that we don't try and do everything. We do some things really well. So we're taking on oil and gas, and we will expand to agriculture, and other tools are better at waste landfills than we are. We can do it well, but we have a very big area with high precision, and those tend to be smaller areas. So the target mode instruments, the satellites, are better suited for that. And we're working together to make sure we get the data that across all of these sources.
It sounds very exciting, and let's hope that the industry sees their responsibility to respond to the data, this amazing data that you're providing with others in this team sport called Let's Get Rid of Methane. Not
Absolutely.
Natural methane, but the stuff that
the
humans.
one thing I'll add is that unfortunately we are seeing feedbacks in natural systems, so they're emitting more, because as the climate warms, we actually see more emissions out of natural systems. So I wish we could just say that we'll do human, but we'll have the indirect human caused as well.
Okay. We can deal with the human much faster, presumably. Yeah.
But we are looking at, can we do things in the natural systems to slow those added emissions as well?
Okay, that's interesting too. Probably the subject for another interview. Thank you very much indeed for your time. Best of luck with your work. It's really important. And let's see if together with what you're doing and others are doing, that we can actually maybe halve those emissions by 2030, a sprint on methane and a marathon on carbon dioxide. Yeah.
Sounds like what we've got to do. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm not sure what we are. I thought it was getting serious, but then he posted this story like 5 minutes ago.
Weird.
That's so toxic. Like, who is she? Is she one of his friends? He's never mentioned her. Who is she?
I don't feel so good.
The transport sector is responsible for approximately 25% of the global greenhouse emissions. 45% of the countries in the world, actually the emissions is the largest source of emissions. So this is really big. And one of the companies in the forefront of this transition to get these energy-related emissions down and from the transport sector is Volvo Cars. So that's why I'm very delighted to have Vanessa Botani with me here on Zoom. Vanessa is Head of Global Sustainability of Volvo Cars. So great to have you with us on our show, Vanessa. How are you today? I think you're muted, so would you
There,
unmute?
how's that?
Here we go. Now we can hear you.
Nice to see you,
Excellent,
Katarina.
excellent.
Thank you.
Likewise, likewise. So, Vanessa, what are the main challenges when it comes to sustainability and also the opportunities, of course, from the transportation sector's perspective?
Thanks. Sure. I mean, we at Volvo Cars, we believe the future is electric, right? But we don't operate in a vacuum. We're really at a pivotal moment to change the course of history right now. And the world really can't afford to see electrification fail. Science is clear, 1.5 degrees Celsius threshold is critical for avoiding the worst impacts of climate change. And like you said, the transport industry accounts for a big part of that, about 1/4 of global emissions, right? So electrification really is key in order to reach our climate targets. I think it was quite clear in that little video that we had just before we started here as well, right? Some of the challenges we see, though, is the fact that the rollout of charging infrastructure has been slower than expected, right? And there's a withdrawal of government incentives in some markets, and there's additional uncertainties created by the recent tariffs on electric vehicles in various markets, right? So, I mean, what we see, for example, is that in the EU, 61% of all charging points are in only 3 member states. That's the Netherlands, that's Germany, and that's France. And the remaining share is scattered across the 24 member states, which covers 80% of the EU surface area. And only 8 of those states have incentives today as well to support the development of EV infrastructure, be it private or public. In the US, the story is the same. California has about 14,000 charging stations, while Ohio has less than 1,400. But then you actually look at China, right, which has well over half of the global electric vehicle sales, accounting for 85% of the world's fast chargers and 60% of the slow chargers. So we have disparities across the world. We announced our decision to go fully electric in 2021 at Volvo Cars. This was ahead of legislation. But, you know, like I said, electrification is not just about us changing the propulsion system, right? We have 5 electric cars on the market. We have 5 more coming before the end of 2030. But we need a supportive ecosystem around us to make this happen, right? It means the charging infrastructure, the deployment of more renewable electricity, reinforcement of the energy grids, and so regulations, investment, and incentives are key here. We have an important role to play in the green transition, and we want to be part of the solution and not just part of the problem.
Thank you, Vanessa. When we met in New York in September, we talked a bit about the revision of the climate goals at Volvo Cars. How has this been received, and what does it entail?
We have had to reduce our ambitions a little bit, but as I said at the beginning, right, we are committed to going all electric. So we've revised our ambitions slightly from being 100% electric in 2030. We've now said we'll be 90 to 100% electrified, which means all cars with a cord, be that a battery electric vehicle or a plug-in hybrid electric vehicle, right? But it doesn't change our trajectory, right? We're still going electric, and to me, it just emphasizes the fact that we really don't operate in a vacuum. We need all of the other actors in the ecosystem to participate here so that we also can reach the ambitions that we have.
Thank you, Vanessa. I've heard you say before that it's important to build where you source and source where you build. What can you tell us about this, please?
Of course. So, I mean, with the current external environment that we're in and many uncertainties around, it's more important than ever that we build resilient supply chains, right? So we have a saying at Volvo Cars, we aim to build where we sell and we source where we build, where it makes sense, right? So in that spirit, we continue to grow our investments in Europe, both with manufacturing and with R&D, all towards electrification. So this includes our existing plants in Sweden and Belgium, as well as the construction of our new EV-only plant in Košice in Slovakia, and a gigafactory in our hometown of Gothenburg. We have a factory in Charleston, as well as a tech hub in Poland, which build on those we already have in Stockholm and in Lund in Sweden. So I can talk about also with tech and sustainability, right? We work with like-minded progressive partners and organizations to make sure that we are addressing the emissions from the most carbon-intensive areas of EV production, which are steel, aluminum, and batteries, right? Those are very big for us. And an example of that is how we work with SSAB, the steel company, to develop near zero emission steel for the automotive industry. And we hope to have this in our vehicles by 2026.
Thank you, Vanessa. So when it comes to sustainability, what else do you do? I know you work a bit with biodiversity too, correct?
Exactly. So we know electrification is our way forward, right? But it's not enough. We have a triple planetary crisis, right? We're looking at climate change, at pollution, at biodiversity loss. So we really need to take a holistic approach to sustainability. And here we go beyond just looking at CO2. So trying to, like you said, address our biodiversity impacts and also work with ocean and coastal health. Nature, is our greatest ally in the fight against climate change, right? So we need to take a holistic approach going beyond CO2 and look at also managing our trade-offs and our risks. So we address our biodiversity footprint. We contribute to restoring ocean and coastal health. And we want to avoid and reduce our negative impacts on biodiversity throughout our value chain as well, while we also make a positive contribution towards nature restoration and regeneration. Our long-term ambition is to be net positive across our value chain and contribute to a nature positive future. So we need to understand our footprint, which is some work that we're doing as well to really see what is the total effect that we have and the impact that we have on species and ecosystems. So for example, we've worked with preservation of ecological status, for example, in building this Kosice plant that I mentioned, where we've established new bird habitats for birds there. And we're also looking closer to home as well. We come from Gothenburg. This is a coastal city. So coastal ecosystems are close to our heart. And we're working with the University of Gothenburg with our Volvo for Life Fund, where we will be working to preserve eelgrass restoration efforts on the west coast of Sweden, and also looking at where we are active in southern China and working with the SEE Foundation to restore coastal wetlands there.
Thank you very much, Vanessa.
We know the future is electric, but we know that we need technology to help us to get there, and we know that we need to look beyond CO2 as well.
Thank you, Vanessa. The examples here with working with the ocean perspective they're truly inspiring. So what are your hopes here for the COP? I mean, we're just a few days away from the end of it, and from your perspective, from Volvo Cars' perspective, what are your hopes?
I really hope that we can come together to create some kind of a commitment to a future that is going to be great for all of us, right? And I think it's a lot of the things that we've talked about here today, using technology to help us to drive change, but also committing to the commitments we've made with governments, in policy and legislation, so that we can make it easier for companies also to drive the change that we need here. I really hope that we can get a commitment to a change and a future that will be more stable and successful for all of us.
Thank you, Vanessa. The revision of the NDCs, I mean, that's very, very, very much, that's what's been talked a lot about here, coming up to the COP in Belém next year in Brazil. And there's also been quite a lot of discussions here on our broadcast about the collaboration and the importance of the companies aligning of their work with the governments when it comes to the NDCs. So what can you say about this from the Volvo Car perspective?
I mean, from our perspective, that's exactly it. Like I said at the beginning, right? We don't operate in a vacuum. We need to work together, and it's not, it's companies, it's the researchers, it's the NGOs, but it's for sure the establishment of the infrastructure around to drive the electrification that we need to change the transport industry, which has, like I said, the 20%, 25% impact on global emissions. And that's a big one that we need to tackle. So we're ready, we want to do that, but we do need to do that together. And I think we spoke about that previously as well with the idea of value networks, right? Working together from different companies, different industries in the value chain outside to make sure that we can find a win-win situation for all of the actors there to push forward. And I think it's those kinds of discussions that we need to be having that we're not as good at perhaps, but need to continue to do.
Well, this is truly inspiring, Vanessa. Thank you so much for joining us here on this broadcast. And we're going to move on and talk to some more people about this very important topic, transportation, that is such a big emitter of greenhouse gases into our atmosphere. So thank you for doing your part, and thank you for joining us at this broadcast. Bye-bye, Vanessa Batani. Thank you.
Thank you.
So from the individual perspective of one car manufacturer, we're now going to go macro and talk about why exponential mobilization of leading companies and countries is needed indeed to speed up change and to win the clean economy. So let's move on and talk about this. With me I have Johan Falk. You are CEO and co-founder of the Exponential Roadmap Initiative, and you're next to me here in the studio. And on Zoom, I have two prominent guests. I have Catherine McKenna, and it's wonderful to have Catherine McKenna here on Zoom with us. She is CEO Climate and Nature Solutions and former Minister of Environment and Climate from Canada. So warm welcome to you, Catherine McKenna. And also next to her on our Zoom screen here, we have Johan Rockström, Professor in Environmental Science and Director, Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research. Wonderful to have you with us here, Johan Rockström.
Yeah,
so I'm turning now first in this panel to Johan Falk here. Why is it so important to mobilize companies and countries at this point in time when it comes to implementing transition plans and scale up climate solutions? Also, of course, to phase out the fossil fuels. Why is this crucial right now?
Yeah, thanks for having me here. So the Exponential Roadmap Initiative, we have a common mission to halve emissions by 2030 through exponential climate action and solutions. We bring together some of the leading transformative and disruptive companies on the planet, and we require all of them to disclose high integrity transition plans and assessing them. What it means practically is halving value chains emissions by 2030 towards net zero by 2040, which is about the energy and material transformation and fossil phase out. It's also about scaling up climate solutions and contributing to climate action in society. And a big part of them are reasonably well on track, the first step, but they will not succeed unless we don't accelerate the green demand. So we really need strong NDCs also backed by transition plans from countries for every sector, because these two have to come together to win.
Thank you, Johan Falk. Turning now to Johan Rockström, could you please give us a short run through of the state, the health of the planet, and also, of course, your views on how strong corporate and national plans and how these connect to solving this problem?
Well, we know that it's really important to recognize that we met in 2009 to solve this problem and failed. 6 years later, we celebrated the Paris Agreement in 2015, the framework to hold global mean temperature rise to 1.5 degrees Celsius limit. The science since then shows that this is a critical limit to avoid crossing irreversible tipping points. Have we made progress? The answer is, unfortunately, at the aggregate level, no. So we are today on a very steep slope. We have only 4 or 5 years to cut global emissions by half. It's a 7.5% reduction per year to have any chance of holding the 1.5 degrees Celsius limit open. It means that for next year, in 2025, task number 1 is the following: to remove 3 billion tons of carbon dioxide from the global economy. That is nothing else but exponential. And of course, policy is absolutely essential here, but so is finance, and so is business, and so is particularly innovation. And I just want to put the finger on one thing now that we have a new Trump administration in the US. We have this sense of backing down on ambitions. One thing we've learned is the following: the only way to really go fast, to really scale at an exponential pace, is not only that we get the right policies in place and the right investments in place, it has to come out as being a winning strategy. It has to be something that citizens feel is better than the previous way of transporting yourself, a way of consuming, a way of building. And that is what the exponential roadmap really is about, to align with science through innovation, but also come out as the winner in the other end. And I think that is what we have to focus on and communicate, because we have all the empirical evidence that this is possible to do.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Johan Rockström. And turning now to Catherine McKenna, you have worked as a minister in Canada, and you've also been chair of the UN High-Level Expert Group. which is urging for exactly this, for high-level, high-integrity transition plans. So drawing from your experience, Catherine McKenna, what are your reflections on what you just heard here from Johan Falk and from Johan Rockström on the opportunity to align the corporate plans and the national transition plans?
Well, it's great to be on, and it's great to be with the two Johans. So look, it's critically important. As Johan Rockström just said, like, we don't have time. We need exponential change. And the reality is we have the solutions and we know how serious the crisis is. But when I was minister, I'll give one example. We needed to bring in a price on pollution, carbon pricing, because if it's free to pollute, you will have more pollution. And that is something that's transformative. But I needed to show to Canadians that it wasn't just environmentalists that supported me, that business supported me. So I created a carbon pricing leadership coalition with leading businesses who stepped up and said, this is actually good for my business, because it will make it cheaper for me to choose less polluting solutions. And I think what Johan says is really important. We need folks to step up, but it can't be, you know, if a business steps up, they're going to do less well. And so we did a report with a high-level expert group 2 years ago to the UN Secretary General. I chaired it. It was called Integrity Matters. So there's a price of admission. You say you're going to be net zero. It's not about 2050, although you need a 2050 target, but you need to be doing the work now. And we set out the criteria, which is, you know, good companies are doing this. We did a progress report this year with the UN Secretary General, where we brought together key actors, so from the private sector, and they showed that, you know, it's no longer an excuse to say that you can't move faster in the climate crisis because it's too difficult or too expensive. But the reality is not everyone is actually implementing this. And this is where you need government and companies working together. So next year is critical. We do need to see more ambitious climate plans, but with details from governments, because business needs certainty. They need to see where the market is going. And that can happen, and governments can provide that. But at the same time, the Secretary General at our event was clear, we need to see new ambitious transition plans to 2030 next year from companies. They need to step up and say what they're doing, because you want an ambition loop. You want governments to be setting the stage, how do we move forward? And then you want companies to be leading the way. And one thing I will say, because obviously there's a lot of focus on Trump, at our event, we had Jay Inslee, the governor of Washington State, but I was at another event with California. They're all in. And so you cannot stop the energy transition. The question is, how do we get the exponential change that we need right now? And we need governments to regulate and step up and provide, you know, the policy that is necessary. And we need businesses to scale both action and money.
Thank you very much, Catherine McKenna. And Johan Rockström, just a few days ago, you co-published an op-ed in one of the leading newspapers in Sweden, Dagens Nyheter, where you mentioned policy diffusion. Can you please tell us about this and how this relates to what we're talking about here?
Yeah, so, you know, it comes out of a rising recognition of that speed and scale are the only currencies that count. So social tipping points and social contagion is something we have to understand better. What is it that makes us go exponential in terms of system change, not at the local level, not at the national level, but at the regional to the global level? And we focus a lot on you know, Roger Everett's 1962 theory of the diffusion of innovation and the cutting point of when you penetrate an innovation up to 20% of markets, you can actually tip over the 80% passive part of the market. So this is the innovation pathway. But there's increasingly evidence also to show that you can have the same kind of spillover effects on policies, where good examples of transparent, objective, effective policymaking in one economy can be reference points and poster childs for behaviors that then can spill over. And one very classic example, of course, is look at the European emission trading scheme. Where does that whole idea of cap and trade on a market-based cap, where you put a cap on emissions and then you basically have a market-based system? Well, it came from California. And it was a policy diffusion from one part of the world, which then spilled over into a completely different part of the world. I mean, we could have chosen simple carbon taxing as was done in the Nordics, for example. So this idea of learning from each other, which suggests the following, that even if you're in a small economy in the world, even if you are in Switzerland or in Colombia or in Finland or in Vietnam, you can actually have a disproportionately large influence today because everything is shaking. We are in the midst, as Catherine points out, we're in the beginning of the end of the fossil fuel-driven global economy. The question is not whether we will phase off coal, oil, and gas. The only question today is, will we be too late? Will we be too late for this to have unmanageable outcomes? And we're in the midst of this gauntlet. This is the transition phase. 150 years of powering in one way is to be replaced by another way. Of course, this is messy. And in this messiness, everyone is looking for the good examples. So you can be a leader today if you are, in Sweden or in New Zealand, in Germany or in China. I mean, the scale, I think we're focusing too much on the size of emitters. I think we should look more at the size of cleverness and innovation and novelty, and looking at that also when it comes to policies is equally important as innovation of technologies.
Thank you, Johan Rockström. This is truly inspiring, and I hope politicians are listening. I'm sure they will be, because this is really sizes and all in this. It's really the great examples that are important. So, Catherine McKenna, do you have any comments on this?
I mean, look, Johan is 100% right. In Canada, actually, when we had a government that was going back on climate, it was our provinces that stepped up and put a price on pollution, did a bunch of other things, methane regulations, a bunch of things that we were able to build on as a federal government when we came in. We saw this when Trump won, came the first time. We saw states really step up, as well as businesses, investors, cities and regions. But I think that we did, so as part of the Integrity Matters process, our 10th recommendation, we only had 10, was you need to regulate. And so there was a policy task force, a net zero policy task force that I'm part of, and it did a report this year, and it actually showed that there's a lot of policy innovation going on. Its focus this year was actually just do a comprehensive look at policy in the net zero space. I think the next agenda is to do, and Johan is always so smart, because I think what we need to do is the Integrity Matters, like our task force, needs to be working with the policy task force and look at examples of where policy innovation or diffusion has made a difference in the real economy, and what can we learn from that. So what is it when you see, say, like IKEA, who is really a leader? They've been able to demonstrate that you can both grow and reduce your emissions and make money. That's what we need to be showing, that you can decouple emissions from growth, ideally, because that's for governments as well as businesses. I think we need to see what is the interaction and what is really making the big exponential difference. I agree with Johan. I only care about scale and speed, and we don't have time. So when people tell me about their net zero 2050 targets, I don't really care. I'm like, what are you doing right now? Are your emissions going down? Is your money going up to clean? Do you have the right incentives in place? Are you lobbying for positive climate action from your government and policy that you need to actually do what you can do? And are you doing things that other people can learn from? So I think that there's actually a huge opportunity in this space, but it requires thinking a bit differently. For environmentalists, I think that we need to be more strategic in really figuring out, okay, what makes the big difference and what can people build on, and where can we learn from unusual suspects? I was always scavenging on the good ideas globally and locally in Canada to be able to do more on climate.
Thank you, Catherine McKenna. So Johan Falk, scavenging and speed and scale, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think we can talk about exponential policies as well. Basically, I think there is an opportunity to actually identify and scale winning policies, the vital few, not overcomplicated. You can easily see, let's say Norway, for example, how did they achieve 90%? It's about relative pricing. It's about providing particular incentives, so that these type of strategies could be copied. So I think there could be work there on actually scaling policies much faster.
Thank
and
you.
Going for the vital few policies.
So all three of you, your thoughts on how we can go from sharing of burdens perspective to more an exponential race. Can you add any more perspectives, any more layers to this? Johan Rockström?
Yeah, I think this is really challenging, that your point about sharing burdens. I mean, I think one of the big breakthrough challenges we have is how do we make the phase out of coal, oil and gas, the whole mitigation agenda, a winning agenda also for the global south, a winning agenda for the weakest economies in the world. And because today we are at this unnecessary defense line between those who are perceiving themselves rightly as victims of climate change and therefore sitting in a state of inertia, when we need to get all economies on board this innovation pathway. And I think the only way to succeed with that is to add one element to the discussion we have here. So far we've discussed about scale and speed through innovation, solutions that give better outcomes. But we also need to de-risk investment. And of course that comes to the whole Baku discussion on finance. But in my view, finance cannot only be about compensating for loss and damage. Finance must be about de-risking innovations towards the new economy of tomorrow. And I think that storyline, unfortunately, is still too much on the sideline. It needs to become much more central, in my view.
Thank you. Catherine McKenna, any thoughts on this?
Look, I totally agree. I used to live in Indonesia, and I was in Singapore. They have a big conference, Ecosperity, and just talking to the Indonesian minister, and he said, like, we need like support to actually get the projects off the ground, but it can't be that I'm paying a massive premium to borrow money, as opposed, like, I don't need your bad rates, interest rates. I can go get them myself. And so I think we need to be creative, but this is going to require governments digging deep. I see this even in Canada, where folks are like, well, it's hard enough for us at home. Well, we're actually a really rich country, and we've benefited greatly from the burning of fossil fuels. And this is a global problem. We're not solving this if we don't figure this out. But I always say to the finance folks, like, I'm not a finance folk. I'm like a reformed politician and a reformed lawyer, and now doing work on the policy side. But there are smart people who can figure out how to scale capital to developing countries and address for risk, whether it's currency risk. I think we overestimate political risk in many of these countries. But we need to get the trillions going. This is about scale. So of course we need governments stepping up, and grant money can help leverage private capital. So can World Bank money and Development Bank money, which is not being used as effectively as it could. But I just think we don't have time. And so really smart people have to focus on solutions, not sitting in meetings and having endless conversations about blended finance. And I think we really need to be very granular. Like, countries have ideas about what they need to do. In Canada, it was very hard phasing out coal. We had to go to communities and listen to people who were angry. And we needed to hear what they needed. They wanted investments in infrastructure. They wanted early retirement. They wanted retraining. They wanted opportunities for those communities. That's normal. That's exactly what normal people want. So as a global community, we can't go tell countries like Indonesia or Vietnam or South Africa, you've got to get off coal, but we're not worried about the transition for workers. We're just worried about how we go from coal to renewables. It won't work that way, but people are smart. We have, as I hear from finance, there's loads of money around the world. We just need to figure out ways to channel it very quickly and effectively to support politicians that are committed to doing hard things, but they can't do it if people don't have jobs, if people don't have opportunities, and if they don't get the money necessary for the transition.
Thank you, Catherine McKenna. Would you like to add anything, Johan Falk?
I think regulation will now push, basically most companies to disclose transition plans as well as countries. And you can start by doing a transition plan like a tick in a box, but when it really becomes sufficient is when you integrate in your business plan and what the countries will integrate in their financial plans. So I foresee if we can achieve that critical mass of all these actors, we can achieve a positive tipping point up to COP30. So that should be our objective.
Well, thank you very much, Johan Falk, and thank you, Catherine McKenna. And I'd like to ask Johan Rockström to stay on for the next panel. Now let's move on. So welcome to the second half of this panel. We're going to talk about how we can scale solutions to drastically cut methane emissions. In parallel, of course, to accelerating our efforts, of course, to cut carbon emissions and also, of course, to phase out fossil fuels. And Johan Rockström is still with us, and also I'm joined by Ingmar Rentzhog, CEO and co-founder of We Don't Have Time. And also still is, of course, Johan Rockström. So Ingmar, We Don't Have Time, an exponential roadmap initiative, has co-launched this campaign called Buy More Time. What is the mission of this campaign? Can you please tell the viewers, and why have you focused so much on this during COP29?
The reason why we started this Buy More Time campaign is to give some concrete solution to the difficult situation we are in the world politics. We have all the solution we need in order to decarbonize the society. It's going to happen. I'm totally convinced. But the problem is it going to happen fast enough? And quite recently, The Guardian did a big survey among people working in climate, and only 6% believes that we're going to be able to halve the emission before 2030. That is what we must do in order to avoid a lot of tipping points and all that. So Buy More Time is about to continue doing everything we can to decarbonize the society, but by also focusing on short-lived climate gases, we can actually get more time to do everything else, because the difference between short-lived climate gases such as methane and others compared to carbon dioxide, they only is up in the atmosphere for a short time, a couple of years, maybe up to 10, 12 years, instead of up to 1,000 years with carbon dioxide. And that means that if we don't need to remove them from the atmosphere, we can stop emit them. And it's also that it's kind of low-hanging fruits. There's a lot of methane emission that is really easy to fix. And previously we haven't known about them, but now we have the satellite data, so it's easy to fix those emission and kind of low-hanging fruit to cut emission faster. So Buy More Time is actually a pathway to succeed with the halving emission for 2030, and that's why we're focusing on it. But it's not doing it instead of cutting carbon. We need to do both.
It's important to emphasize the latter, of course. So Johan Rockström, you have been part of the initiative, starting the initiative, Exponential Roadmap Initiative, together with Johan Falk and also Owen Gaffney. So could you please tell us the scientific, the benefits of cutting these super pollutants out of the atmosphere, and how this is related to what we spoke about earlier in the previous panel too?
Yes, so to just give you a little quick, let's say, deep dive into the lab, so to say, into the cutting edge of science and what really concerns us right now. So emitting greenhouse gases, so carbon dioxide is the most dominant gas, 70%, but then we have the big warming non-CO2 gases of methane, nitrous oxide, and then we have the black carbon and the cooling aerosols, and of course all the chlorofluorocarbons. And what we see as a trend line over the past 10 years is a big shift in the climate forcing caused by these greenhouse gases on the energy imbalance on planet Earth, which causes the warming. Up until 2010, you could see that the warming forcing by non-CO2 gases were cancelled out by cooling gases from air pollution. So essentially, up until 2010, the energy imbalance, the whole global heating was net caused by carbon dioxide. But from 2010 onwards, something happens. Methane increases faster than before 2010, and aerosols reduce faster than we had expected, which is really positive because the aerosols are air pollutants in cities. So these are sulfates and nitrates causing or explaining the premature death of 8 to 9 million people per year. So we're cleaning up the air in the cities, but we're not getting off fossil fuels. And not only that, methane is increasing faster than in previous times. So over the past 10 years, climate forcing has jumped up very rapidly. So we are today at a level of energy imbalance, which I think is the strongest candidate why we experience such an extremely warm temperature rise over the past 10 years, an increasing rate of warming. We have actually crashed through 1.5 degrees Celsius if you look at the last 12-month period. This is not only a super El Nino, it's more than that. There's something more than that, and I think it has to do exactly with this topic of the importance of getting off the non-CO2 gases as well. So the Exponential Roadmap Initiative, if anything, over the past 10 years have been proven to be even more important than we previously thought. I mean, we know that the global carbon budget, which has been our focus, the Exponential Roadmap Initiative of cutting emissions by half every decade and reaching net zero by 2050, is all about carbon dioxide. It's that we're running out of time to stay within the carbon budget. But there is an additional budget, which is the non-CO2 gases, which are also causing havoc by emphasizing or accelerating warming rather than canceling out through cooling. And this is what we need to also recognize as point of urgency.
Thank you. So Ingmar Rentzhog, you're proposing you would like to see a Montreal Protocol for super pollutants. Why?
First, we have had lately quite a lot of pledges to reduce methane. At COP29 and yesterday actually it was 35 countries including Russia and the United Arab Emirates and some others that pledged to reduce methane. But we know also that those pledges are seldom executed. So I think we need to create legal binding agreement. And the Montreal Protocol was something that worked quite differently from the Paris Agreement. Montreal Protocol in 1987, 46 nations agreed to start phasing out freons that were hurting the ozone layer. And they agreed on this, it was legally binding, and they had a phase-out plan. And now 200 countries have signed the Montreal Protocol, and the ozone layer are actually healing. So the Montreal Protocol, the reason why it worked, it was so much easier to agree on phasing out freons, because the industry had alternatives. It was not as big as, the energy source powering our society. But if you see methane and other short-lived climate gases, often it's just a byproduct. It's like the waste. So by focusing on, we mean that you can do something similar where you actually get rid of those. And it's very interesting now that 130 countries have pledged to reduce quite fast methane emissions. So why can't we have those 130 countries, including many oil countries? That is interesting because this is not their main thing. Can't we have them to agree on some similar thing like the Montreal Protocol? We don't need to start with 200 countries, we just need to start with all the countries that already have agreed on pledging to do it. So the Montreal Protocol, something similar, go from pledges to legal binding agreement.
Thank you, Ingmar Rentzhog. Johan Rockström, what are your thoughts on this suggestion?
No, I agree with Ingmar. I think it's a good suggestion. And by the way, I think it's a good suggestion also in relation to the panel discussion we had previously here, that the Montreal Protocol is a policy diffusion example. It's a successful, legally binding global framework where a minority of countries in the world had a phase-out plan, and that spilled over to all the countries in the world. And doing something similar for methane and for nitrous oxide, for example, as non-CO2 gases, would definitely be both beneficial, because I think it can remind the world that the only way to get off carbon dioxide from phasing out coal, oil and gas is also phase out plans. I'm very worried that we have created a legally binding framework in the Paris Agreement with voluntary national NDCs, which are not where countries are not held accountable. In the Montreal Protocol, countries are held accountable. So I think that is in itself kind of an interesting way of trying to push forward on the Paris Agreement.
Thank you, Johan Rockström. Any thoughts on how we could make this actually happen?
Well, you may have seen that we have proposed a COP reform letter that created a bit of noise in Baku. This letter sent to Simon Steele and the leadership of UNFCCC has only one purpose, which is to strengthen the COP, not to weaken the COP. We want to make the COP start to deliver on all, as Ingmar says, we have so many pledges and so many commitments on methane, on afforestation, on adaptation, on loss and damage, on 1.5 degrees Celsius, on transitioning away from fossil fuels. I mean, everything that is necessary to solve this problem is in place, legally in place. It's not perfect, but it's in place. So I think that is the key issue here, is to recognize that we need to reform what the COP meeting is all about, and have more discussions on, or focus on accounting against phase-out plans, which where countries are held accountable.
Thank you, Johan Rockström. And before we conclude this session here, I have a final question to you that's related to your part in the documentary Climate Extremes, where you're one of the climate experts. Can you please tell us about this documentary?
Yeah, well, to begin with, and I see that my dear friend David Wallenstein is online here. It comes out of a sense of frustration, to be honest. David and I have been meeting over the years, and he rightly reminds us in the science community that, look here, you have such an enormous untapped potential. You're kind of underperforming on communication. You're sitting on all this evidence and all this top relevant information, which needs to reach out in a much broader way. And that was what triggered this idea of experimenting with really fast science visualization and getting it out to the world in a new way of communicating. And I'm very much in support of that. We need to go viral in a much more prominent way with the truth, because we are unfortunately in a world full of troll industries and misinformation and manipulation on so many of the information highways in the world that it's an information war out there, and we need to play the game.
Thank you very much, Johan. And we're going to return to this documentary at the end of this session. We're going to have an interview broadcasted with the director of the film. But first, let's watch your presentation of the Buy More Time campaign, Ingmar Bentzon. And thank you very much, Johan Rockström, for joining us here today.
This is the climate crisis today. We're kind of leaning backwards. And the more emission we put up there, the more we're leaning it. But we can still do this, right? The problem, if we pass 1.5 degree, and we're very near, we're kind of there, but if we stay there and we just keep going up, there is a big risk of hitting a tipping point. And when we hit a tipping point, this share will be very hard to put back up. So this is what we must avoid for the climate. And we have a cure for this. The only thing we need in order to make it is more time. We need to buy more time. And now we feel the resistance from the politicians. But when we're up here, they will not resist the green transition, because the green transition are the majority. So the policy will change when the technology changes, but we need more time. So how can we get more time? The problem with carbon dioxide, when we emit it, it will go up. And it will stay up there for up to 1,000 years. Maybe we can kind of try to remove it, but it looks kind of hard to do it, very expensive. Methane is another greenhouse gas. It's a very common greenhouse gas. It's the second biggest contributor to global warming. And there's a big difference between methane and carbon dioxide. When we release this, it comes down again. On average, 12 years. It's a big difference between 1,000 years, 12 years. So the solution here is that we need to stop emit methane. And if we do that, we can actually reverse global warming with up to 0.5 degrees. That is the time we need to do everything else, because we still need to stop the carbon dioxide. So this is great news. And where does this methane come from? This is one of the sources. Bananas. Waste, food waste. 20% of methane emission comes from waste. But guess what? When I arrived here this morning, I took the bus, and the bus in Sweden, in Stockholm, are powered with bioenergy. We don't emit hardly any methane from waste. So other countries can do the same. 45% from methane comes from the fossil fuel industry. And this is a lot of emission that is really easy to fix. It's just fix the pipe. Cows are burping 4 times every 5 minutes. Agriculture adds up to 40% of the methane emissions. Many companies working on this, where you have a food additive, and you give that to the cows, and they burp up to 80% less. So what do we need? We need to look at the fridge. All the fridges we had when I was a kid were powered by a dangerous gas. And when that was released up in the air, it was destroying the ozone layer. If we hadn't fixed it, we will not be able to walk outside today and show naked skin. But we're not doing that, because the industry, the manufacturers of the fridges, the chemical companies, and bold world leaders met in Montreal, where they decided to ban freons, phase it out, put the funding behind it, and today we have perfectly fresh food and we don't use freon anymore. Isn't it great? It saved humanity once, so we can do it twice. And there is one more thing. This year in Mars, there was a new satellite launched that is called the Methane satellite. And it will measure open data where we have emission from methane, leakage, and we will know exactly where we need to fix the problem. We don't have that for any other climate gases, but we have it for methane. So a legal system, some funding, and the data is everything we need. And this is what Buy More Time is all about. We can do this.
So we have talked about how countries and companies can and must increase their effort to help make it easier for solutions to scale exponentially. One who knows more about this than most people, especially from the company perspective, is Maria Mendelucci. And we're very happy that Maria is with us here via Zoom. And Maria Mendelucci is CEO of the We Mean Business Coalition. So wonderful to have you join us, Maria Mendelucci. How are you today?
Thank you. Yeah, very good. Thank you.
So Maria, you've been listening to the two panels. What are your thoughts?
It's really interesting. It's always very inspiring to talk with Joanne. But both Joanne and Catherine McKenna, now the video was very, very telling. One of the things that that first stick in my mind is this thing about winning the narrative for citizens. Because there's so much information and disinformation out there. Citizens believe that the transition to a clean economy is more expensive, but actually it's not. And it is how do we make sure that they also benefit from the fact that it's less expensive. It is also another thing that I thought it was really interesting is this concept of diffusing the policies that work and how that can create some policy tipping points. The European trading system, carbon pricing, is a fantastic example. Now, as I was in COP last week in Baku, where you are, I spoke to the UK government and they were telling me how they're going to come about to phase out fossil fuels from power generation. And it was all about planning the phase out and planning the phasing. Apparently there are 8,000 gigawatts on the pipeline of renewable energy, which are not needed because we need to replace fossil fuels. To replace fossil fuels, we need to plan that transition so that people move from internal combustion engines to electric vehicles, from gas heating to air to heat pumps. And that can be done, if done with good planning, it can bring communities along. And that's the third element that I thought was interesting, is the concept of the just transition, right? So the just transition is about how do you bring the workers that have been working on the fossil fuel industry to benefit from the transition, to reskill and to look at the future with much more optimism. And yeah, clearly those three things are really important.
Thank you, Maria. The We Mean Business Coalition really tries to embolden the policymakers to listen to the business community to make stronger climate policies. So do the policymakers listen to you?
Well, sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. I think they listen to many, and that's rightly so. Last year, we did put forward a campaign that it was called Fossil to Clean, where we rallied companies. There were 260 companies that sent a letter to policymakers asking for fossil fuel phase out to be included in the text. We had transition away from fossil fuels, which is a fantastic way to address this. And I have to say that when I was at COP last week, I heard countries looking at how they're going to implement the three things: tripling renewables, doubling energy efficiency, and transition away from fossil fuels. So that was a good win. Not all the companies, would agree with that, but I think the ones that we want to work with, the ones that want to progress on this agenda, the ones that are committed, are pushing for this to happen, and they need the policy frameworks, they need that planning, that permitting, they need, the regulatory frameworks to do so. So I think sometimes they listen. I think often they do. I think often they want to validate what they're doing and see whether the business are supportive, and that's where we are. Also, it means that sometimes we're not supportive, right? Because it needs to make business sense, okay? So it's not about supporting everything policymakers are doing, but pushing together for greater ambition and for solutions to some of the barriers that business face.
So Maria, just a few days here at the COP, when you were actually physically here, the We Mean Business Coalition coordinated a statement that was directed to the G20 leaders and forcing and pushing for stronger action in Rio. So could you please tell us about this statement?
Well, yes, because we saw that the negotiations in Baku were a little stalled. And because we are dealing with something that is very complex, which is the financing, it requires the G20 countries to step in and to push for further and bigger ambition, because we know that at the end there will be, the G20 countries are the ones that are going to deliver some of this funding to the poorest countries that don't meet G20. So I think that's what it was needed. We also called for them to push for more text on the transition away from fossil fuels. We were not happy that it was not included, although it was referenced through the reference to the UA consensus. I think we have to look at these things at the mirror. We need to triple renewables, but we also need to reduce the use of fossil fuels. If not, the emissions will continue to grow. So as I say there, and I continue to say, the best way to address climate change is to stop burning fossil fuels. So let's make sure that all the NDCs that are coming forward include elements on how they're going to stop that and replace it with clean energies.
So Maria Mendilucci, would you say that this COP is just a transition to Rio, or is it really, what is the importance of this COP from your perspective?
I think from my perspective, there are two things that are important. The first one is that we need to have a good finance deal. We need to support developing countries and the poor countries so that they can do the transition and prepare to the impacts from climate change. The second thing is that this is the COP where we're starting to hear from countries about their NDCs, the headline number, the ambition that they're going to include on those NDCs, and that the NDCs from both the UK and Brazil gave a very good signal to other countries what is required. But it's not only the NDC and that figure, it is the plans that go with it that business are interested to. So I think that from now until the next COP, we need to work on those. That truly is going to be the investment plan of the countries. That's how they're going to attract massive amounts of funding. And so we need to help countries develop plans that are investable we could make those entities investable.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Maria Mendelucci, CEO of the Women Business Coalition, for your important work and for also your reflections here on the previous two panels and your fantastic work. Best of luck,
Thank
and we'll see you. I hope to see you again.
Yes, for sure. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And now let's move on to not move on, but we're going to talk about the climate extremes at the abyss, which is a documentary that explores critical tipping points and also the non-linear dynamics shaping our climate's future. And Professor Johan Rockström, who was just on our broadcast, he is one of the experts featured in this film. So we will now watch a few snippets from this important film, and after this watching we will have a conversation. I'm going to be able to interview the creator, director and producer of this documentary, and his name is David Wallerstein. So please enjoy the snippets, and then we're going to go into the interview.
The difference between today and tomorrow's weather, wherever we're sitting at the moment, is probably more than 1.5 degrees centigrade. So you might ask, what's the big deal? But to put that into perspective, the difference between today and the last ice age, when there were even thousands of feet of ice overlying places where there are today major cities in the Northern Hemisphere, is just a handful of degrees centigrade. The range of warming that we've already surpassed or are on track to meet in the coming decades is just this massive, geologically significant amount of warming, and that usually takes many thousands of years to occur, but something that we're going to see in less than a century, and literally within an individual human lifespan.
So the Holocene is a warm interglacial. It is a 14 degrees Celsius planet. It's inside this corridor of life, the +2 maximum warmth to -6, but it's even more narrow. It's actually 14 degrees Celsius plus minus 0.5. So already today, at 1.45, we are actually almost a magnitude 3 times outside of the warmest temperature on Earth since we left the last ice age. I mean, 1.5 is a very big number. When we burn oil, coal, and gas and emit greenhouse gases, that causes a massive energy imbalance on planet Earth. But what happens with the planet is that the response is that the ocean takes up heat, ice sheets take up heat when they melt. 50% of all the carbon dioxide is absorbed in oceans and natural systems on land. And all these interactions is what explains, when we push these systems too far, that they can flip over from the current state that buffers in a very effective way to lose that capacity.
Some of the rain that falls and makes it a rainforest that keeps the Amazon moist is essentially recycled. But if any part of that process, that self-reinforcing constructive feedback cycle, becomes interrupted, then the whole thing can suddenly start to fall apart.
When you cross a tipping point, you self-amplify warming, and the warming leads to even more extreme events. So there's a very strong, unfortunate, vicious relationship between tipping points and extreme events. For every 1/10 of a degree that increases, you get more frequent and more fierce droughts, heat waves, floods, strengthened hurricanes, more disease patterns, more fires. That is quite linear, and it's a fast variable. It happens very fast, continuously, across the world, and it hits fast.
We know that the water vapor holding capacity of the atmosphere increases by about 7% per degree centigrade of warming. That means that every time you have an additional degree of warming or fraction of degree of warming, the degree to which the atmosphere can hold water vapor increased by a greater amount than the last time you warmed by that degree.
Very strong and fascinating, and of course, very important content. In these snippets. So I'm very honored and pleased to have with us here on our broadcast the creator, director, and producer of Climate Extremes, David Wallerstein. So wonderful to have you with us here on Zoom. And you're joining us from where?
Thank you for having me. I'm here from Europe. Yeah, thank you very much.
And you're based in California. Are you joining us from California?
Yeah, no, not today. Yeah, I'm in Iceland today.
Okay, great. So David, every journey has its beginning. So could you please tell us how you started this project?
Well, it really came out of a lot of discussions with scientists over the years, and feeling in our discussions that there was a lot of information and ideas in their minds that wasn't really making it to the public domain. We've learned a lot about climate change in the past 20 years. And I think even wherever you stand in terms of how you want to participate in the climate fight, people have a general understanding of some of the dynamics of climate, but I felt that so many other ideas and the complexity of our planet was not really getting through to the public. And so the question is, how do you really quickly get more messages and ideas out into the public domain? And I felt that the best way to get more messaging out there would be to do a very quick documentary. So documentaries can take a long time. My goal was to do something within months, have it finished and then delivered to the public within a couple months, because as the topic of today, we don't have the time. So I've made documentaries sometimes that have taken years to finish and get distributed. And I felt we needed something that could be made quickly, finished quickly, and delivered to the public immediately over YouTube. Actually, it's a free film over YouTube. So you don't have to request permission from others or schedule launch dates on YouTube. You control everything yourself, and it happens immediately, as is the power of social media. So that was the idea behind the film.
This is great. So David, what was the hardest part of getting this documentary done?
Well, actually, I want to thank our team. I'm a co-director of the film with someone named Jonatli Gudjonsson, and we have Irim Biller as our associate producer, and there was an animator named Mustafa. I can't remember his last name at the moment, sorry. But anyways, getting those animations sufficiently right. I mean, they're just conceptual, so any scientist could look at them and say, well, you missed this and that there. I mean, that's the nature of drawing, a high-level concept through an animation. But, being able to match what the scientists were saying with a visual as they're talking, that was very important to get right. And it's not easy. We were fortunate to find a great animator in Mustafa to do it quickly. But I think that was quite challenging, because really the film is very elegant. I want to say how we did it to maybe inspire other filmmakers out there, because it's not really complicated. We spent a day or two at Potsdam, the Potsdam Institute, with Johan and his team, and we spent a day or so at ECMWF, the European Weather Forecasting Agency there. And we're talking like 1 or 2 days of filming, and then there was plenty of editing going along, but the editing can move fast with putting in stock footage that you get online from all the online sites. And then the animation was what really took time, to blend that in, and that takes someone really, working with their hands, I believe, to add those animations to the film. But really, it's a very elegant process. Without the animations, I think the whole thing could have been done in like 45 days or something like that. So, or maybe even less, a team could work faster. And I think that's necessary now to get more complex ideas about climate and Earth behavior, planetary behavior out into the public domain, to help people understand more what we're really dealing with here with all of these climate challenges.
So David, how has the documentary been received so far?
Yeah, well, I think it's been very well. Thank you. It's been out for about 3 weeks. We have about 440,000 views. Very good, and some good likes going along with it, and some good reviews on IMDb. But it's not enough. We're targeting 8 billion people, one way or the other. By the way, we saw that over half the users actually watched the film on television, which was very interesting to me. I was envisioning everyone using their phone or maybe a laptop or something, but actually most people watch it on a TV, which is great. But you don't have to watch it on TV. You can watch it on your phone. You can watch it on a laptop. We really want, as many people as possible, even if you're not interested in climate and you don't think you care about these issues. There's a lot of people like that in the world. We have to be very aware of those who are not yet really engaged in these topics. That was a key concern. How do we address all of them? We tried to make a film that imagined someone not being interested in these topics, not being sympathetic, and they come across this content, and do they keep watching or not? And we wanted to make it really a dialogue from the scientists directly to the viewer, and hopefully they'll be interested to hear what the scientists have to say in their own language. It's only the scientists discussing how the Earth behaves now, and it is expected to behave in the future, and has behaved over actually millennia. Johan has a very interesting description of how the Earth has evolved over millions of years, which I think is also very interesting for anyone to understand that. Most people don't think about it, but we need to think about it more, because we are now pushing ourselves in a position where we're going to start changing the dynamics of Earth. And we've had ice ages. I think everyone generally acknowledges things like that. And now we're pushing ourselves into new directions where you see transformation on Earth, unfortunately.
Well, thank you very much, David, for doing this important work and for coming out into our studio today. And if all of you viewers here, you can watch. Of course, you can watch the full documentary here on We Don't Have Time. So you just go to wedon'thavetime.org/COP29 and you click on the November 20 day, that's today, and you scroll down all the way down to the gray boxes with the title sessions, and you can play it on demand. And you can also find and rewatch all our sessions here from COP29, as well as all our one-on-one interviews with special guests here and other great climate content. So thank you again, David. And now we're going to hear from some very interesting guests that we have been interviewing during the days here at COP27. We're getting tired here, the second last day. COP29 here in Baku, in our studio and also outside in the media center. And we'll be back with some live broadcasting at 6 p.m. local time here in Baku. So please enjoy the interviews, and thank you again, David Vellerstein. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
So we have another wonderful guest with us here in Baku on the Caspian Sea at COP29, the UN Climate Conference. Could you say your name and your title, please?
Thank you for the invitation. I'm Max Andunirina Fontaine, and I'm the Minister of Environment and Sustainable Development from Madagascar.
Okay. I have to say, Max, you're probably the youngest environment minister I've ever met, which I think is absolutely fantastic. How old are you?
I'm 28 years old, actually.
Oh, wow. That's incredible. That really is.
Thank you.
More than that, though, you are part of a new initiative with 3 other countries. Could you tell us what this initiative is called, and what does it seek to achieve?
So it's been almost a year that we have been working with Bhutan, Panama and Suriname on creating a new coalition to the United Nations, because we are the last countries on Earth that are carbon negative. To join this coalition is really simple, only one criteria: you sequester more carbon than you emit. If you achieve to do that, our doors are open to all the other countries on Earth who are able to sequester more carbon than they emit. But also, we are nature-positive countries, because all of our countries have amazing biodiversity, and it's the combination of this carbon-negative and nature-positive that makes our country real solutions in the fight against climate change.
So, in a sense, what has happened to our world is that with the Industrial Revolution, growth in population, but also the kind of industrialization of the world, is that the nature has been gradually destroyed in many, many countries, particularly, and we need to restore that balance. And I think that is what the Paris Agreement is all about. So in a sense, what you're doing in your countries, your 4 countries, are kind of, in a sense, what other countries need to rediscover. And perhaps in the way you manage your country, you may have some of the clues on how these other countries who have lost so much biodiversity and ecosystems could restore their balance. So you are a library of not only practice but also reality. Do you think that's correct, the way you manage your island?
I think the balance image that you talked about is really right, because it's impossible to preserve the carbon negative status only based on mitigation. We have to balance adaptation and mitigation, so we need to make sure that we preserve our carbon sinks. And this carbon sinks sequester the carbon from our country, but also from the other countries, from the developed countries. But to preserve them, it's a way of living. Our populations, they live hands in hands with nature, because 80% of Madagascar population lives in rural areas. So then it's obvious that they rely on nature for every need. There is a lack of industrialization, of course, but this way of living in harmony with nature is a key for us. And even if we develop ourselves, even if we industrialize our country, which is a priority of the president, we need to make sure that this economic development is aligned with the protection of our natural resources, and that this development has as a main pillar the sustainable management of these resources. So even, for instance, for the tourism, we want to make ecotourism. For the industrialization, it will be industrialization based around our natural resources, but in a sustainable way, instead of just exploiting. How can we exploit, create social and economic development, but make sure that the next generation will be able to use also the same resources?
Yeah. So to hand on a Madagascar to the next generation that is still healthy and functioning. Yeah, exactly.
It's the biggest challenge.
Yeah. How are you powering Madagascar these days? What kinds of energy systems do you have, and do you need more renewable energy?
So actually we have a mix of hydro dams, of solar panels, but also we use thermic energy, fossil fuels. But the goal and the vision of the president is to raise the part of the renewable energies. We have two huge hydro dam projects that are actually in the pipe and really close to beginning. We have also a big vision on solar panels because of the potential that we have. Madagascar is an island in the middle of the Indian Ocean. We have an amazing potential in terms of light, the daylight, and many also water reserves. We have a so big island that it's like a small continent. So it's not only one type of renewable energy that you are going to focus on. It's a balance depending on the potential of every region. In the north, we have a lot of wind. So why not put the north under wind power? In the south, it will be the solar. In the highlands, it will be the water, and in the western, so this is how we will make our energy mix.
I mean, one optimistic thing about this climate change story is it's certainly triggering and has triggered a lot of creativity among engineers and people in the digital space, and so there's a lot of creativity going on, and there are all kinds of new renewable energy systems being developed in different parts of the world. I'm thinking about there's now floating photovoltaics. In the UK, the wind turbines are now going very, very, very far out to sea. And they are not big metal things in the seabed, but they are tethered with cables. And you can deploy them very quickly with higher wind speeds. So all these opportunities are happening and could benefit Madagascar. But the question is finance, isn't it? And are you getting sufficient finance from the international community or bilateral finance from friendly nations? Do you know how much you need to be...
Yes.
Do you know what you need going forward? Yeah.
I will answer to your question in two parts. The first one is on the tech-based innovations, like the floating solar panels. It's amongst the presidents of Madagascar vision to do that in a lake near the capital, near the airport, to optimize each square meters that you have. And for the financing, we talk every COP about the lack of financing. And for Madagascar, our numbers are really clear. From 2020 to 2030, to achieve our climate goals, we need $24 billion US dollars. If we keep the actual trend, this business as usual scenario, which means optimizing all the funds we have access to, we would reach at the maximum $7 billion. 7 out of 24. So not even 1/3 of what we need, we are expecting to get until 2030. So there is a big problem, and we make innovations in terms of technology. We also need to make innovation in terms of climate finance. And that is why Madagascar made so many efforts with the IMF, with the World Bank, with the GEF, to create new funding mechanisms, which will be our only way to bridge the gap of funding, how to involve private sector, how to make blended finance. If we have 1 billion potential, how can we transform this 1 billion into 5 billion? And we are really proud of all the efforts we have been doing already since COP28 in Dubai in terms of climate finance with these partners.
Okay, so you are obviously worried about climate change, but you are also courageous as a country. You're fighting your cause to be a fully sustainable society, not just now, but well into the future. And you need that support, that bridge between what you're getting now and what you actually need to deliver. Yeah. What is your message at the moment when you are talking to other governments here at COP29? What do you want to see from COP29?
Like the UN Secretary General said, climate finance is not charity, it's investment. And when you talk about mitigation, we hope that at Baku, we can find an agreement to move on mitigation. How can all the countries raise their ambitions to make sure that we can keep the path to 1.5? But actually, with the actual trend, if we go business as usual, we should forget about the 1.5. It's impossible to reach. So everyone needs to make more efforts, and that's also the pledge from the G0, is that we will make everything, all our best, to keep that carbon negative country status. But we call also on other countries to make more efforts to reduce their emissions. So it's been many sessions and COPs that, for the mitigation, for instance, we didn't find any agreement, any outcomes out of the COP. And there is a Rule 16 that says that if we don't find an agreement, we'll talk about it to the next COP. This year, it's impossible that we do again this Rule 16 saying that we are going to talk about it in Brazil, because every year that we are committed to inaction, it costs billions of dollars of disasters. We need to understand that this money, we are going to pay it anyway. But the latest we pay it, the more expensive it will be. $1 that you invest today in mitigation and adaptation is billions of disasters that you save for tomorrow.
Yeah, good point. Well, Minister, it's been a great pleasure to talk to you on We Don't Have Time. I've been to many countries in the world. I've never been to Madagascar. I must make that a priority, although I don't know how to get there in a purely environmentally friendly way, but I could try. But thank you much for your work, and really wish you great success. Thank you.
Thank you for the invitation, and please be our guest to Madagascar. Preserving Madagascar's biodiversity is preserving the world's heritage, so you're all welcome to come visit our amazing biodiversity.
Okay. Guest here at COP29 in Baku in Azerbaijan on the Caspian Sea. It's Diana Vorsatz, and she's vice chair of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and it's a great pleasure to see her. You're the chair of the Scientific Committee for the upcoming IPCC report on climate change in cities. Why are you producing this report?
First of all, thank you very much for having me. It's a privilege. This is an especially important report because cities generate over 70% of emissions globally, even though in terms of population, we have roughly half of global population living there. But also, cities are extremely important because that's where over 80% of global GDP is being produced. That's where a lot of the innovations are happening. That's where a lot of change is happening fast. Also, that's where the majority of people are exposed to the impacts of climate change, because cities can even aggravate the different impact, or at least concentrate the different impacts of climate change. So that's really an area where we can best address climate change, both in terms of the impacts, vulnerability and adaptation, as well as greenhouse gas emission reductions.
So, as you're saying, they're big producers of greenhouse gas emissions as cities, and what do you envision is going to be some of the key elements of what we might term a net zero city?
So the IPCC has already had urban chapters in several of our previous reports. In the sixth assessment report, we identified 3 key strategies in order to get also to net zero, and in general for cities to reduce their emissions significantly as compared to baseline, because of course in developing country cities the first goal is just to move away from big growth of emissions and first just reduce that, and later on we can get to net zero. So the three strategies, the first one is to reduce energy and material demand while providing the same or even better services to the people and even more well-being. Second, once we reduce that, of course not time-wise, but just strategy-wise, then supply the remaining material and energy needs by zero carbon energy sources and fuels. Mostly that means electrification in cities. So we see most of the cities electrifying and supplying more and more of the needs by clean, first of all, electricity, and then gradually that electricity and the other fuels that are coming to the cities are becoming decarbonized. And the third strategy is to take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and capture it in cities. So that is the area where we see a lot of new developments, so carbon dioxide removal. But already we documented in the sixth assessment report that, for example, urban trees are already removing 7 gigatons, so that's a lot of carbon dioxide, 7 gigatons of carbon dioxide, and every year they are capturing further further 400 million tons of carbon dioxide. So getting nature back into our cities will not only capture more of the emissions, but also make our cities more livable, and also these help more with adaptation efforts through the reduction of the urban heat islands.
Urban areas are very different, aren't they, in different places? If you look at, say, a Nordic city like Stockholm versus, say, a developing country city in, say, I don't know, the Central African Republic, for example, or Dakar, or Nairobi, Kenya. So they're all very, very different indeed. Is it possible then to take the assessment in a way that takes into account these different points in development of so many different cities in the world?
That's a really excellent question that really captures the challenges for our special report in cities. So what we have done in the sixth assessment report, we have identified 3 key typologies. So first of all, the already established cities, and then the next was the rapidly urbanizing cities, and the third one, which are the emerging cities. So these 3 categories. But even these 3 are very diverse within themselves. So what this city's special report is going to do is we have a special chapter on typologies, or that means the different types of cities, how cities differ, and we hope that within a chapter we are going to be able to distinguish the solutions for different along different axes, meaning not only development level, but also geography, culture, and local climate, and different types of issues which matter to decision makers that distinguish cities for different decision-making communities. So certainly the report has a very strong aim at trying to break down the one-size-fits-all to several different packages of messages. And we are going to, one of the tools what we are going to use for that is to use case studies, so galleries of case studies, and see how cities have already been succeeding in addressing some of these challenges. Since this report is going to be very solution-oriented and very relevant for urban action, which also is facilitated by government and multilateral action. So we really need to address all the multiple levels of governance, but certainly we need to be want to be very relevant to all these different decision makers, and hopefully really focus on how they can put these actions into place and what is available for them.
We're essentially living in a world that's fast approaching 1.5 degrees centigrade, which is often termed by many people as the safety limit, in a sense, under the Paris Climate Change Agreement, and for all kinds of scientific reasons. Do you think that we have learnings already that we can somehow translate from the cities into faster action, whether it be in terms of carbon dioxide, but also now, of course, a lot of people are talking about methane and other super pollutants. Is there something we can learn from what we know already?
Absolutely. There are plenty of best practices in cities that can be learned for other cities, but also perhaps in other areas. But it's important to understand that already over 1,000 cities and some national jurisdictions have net zero emission goals around mid-century. Some of these cities, clearly in the more developed areas, have actually earlier net zero emission goals. So they are already doing a lot, and a lot of action is taking place, and we definitely can learn a lot from them. We can also learn very much from different ways of, for example, urbanization. So urbanizations patterns which encourage city design and urban form that favor local walking, cycling, so non-motorized transportation, which are not only much more less greenhouse gas emissions intensive, but also are more inclusive socially, because you can easier access jobs, you can easier access healthcare, other opportunities. You're not locked into potentially having to own a car or drive a car or have access to more expensive forms of transportation. So in many, many different ways how different cities are showing the way, because as we mentioned, cities are innovating because they are smaller, it's easier for them to innovate. They are innovating in different solution spaces, and there is a lot of examples that we can learn from these.
So I suppose, hopefully, when this report is done, we're going to actually see a stronger focus on the cities because of the potential benefits society can get and the world from action there, and also for the cities themselves, because they often struggle to find the finance to actually meet their climate plans themselves. Could this also be a help and a stimulation, in a sense, for more investment being focused on the urban networks?
Absolutely, that's a really important point, because typically climate finance is talking about mostly just energy forms and mostly the supply side. Nevertheless, our reports showed that, for example, the sixth assessment report showed that we could reduce 40 to 70% of emissions through demand side action. So focusing also on why we need the energy, what we need the energy and materials for. And cities are exactly the entry points to make those changes happen. So if we also consider directing finances to cities and the demand side where people and families are actually living, where businesses are working, then we often get more we get solutions which also result in more benefits for cities and businesses and families. So I hope that the financing structures in the end are going to allocate more and more of these resources to cities where not only the majority of our population lives, but also where majority of the GDP is being produced, as mentioned, and also where a lot of the fast action is taking place. So that's where we can achieve, with this financing, fast results. Because, as you said, it is important that often cities are struggling to find the financing. So financing can go a long way through actions in cities.
Good. Well, I think we need to wrap up there. Thank you very much indeed, Diana, for being with us. We wish you best of luck with this report, and we hope that the governments internalise it and, like all IPCC reports, act on it. Maybe now we're 5 years away from 2030 with even more urgency than perhaps they've been doing in the past. As we near the end of COP29, the question on everyone's mind is what progress has been made or is being made, and perhaps more interestingly, why more progress is not being made. Has this COP produced anything substantial like the results we've all been hoping for? Will COP29 be considered a success or a failure? And perhaps even more importantly, are governments really addressing the climate crisis with the urgency it deserves? Or is it just baby steps every year? We're going to hear from business, city leaders, an accomplished youth delegate and a Green Group leader to get their opinion and to hear whether governments are listening and, more importantly, acting with the speed the science says is imperative. First up in this discussion is the business perspective. We are pleased to welcome Andrew Prague, Managing Director for Policy with the We Mean Business Coalition. It brings together a range of influential business and finance coalitions that represent the voice of climate action in this sector. Andrew, lovely to see you. Thank you so much for being here. Why is the voice of business so important in events like these COPs?
Well, I think the voice of business, and indeed all of civil society, is extremely important to keep the pressure on governments and to show them that there is a strong message from the real economy, that people want to see these changes and that business needs to see the policy that they want to make this transition, which they see makes good business sense. They see that climate change is a business risk for them through the impacts on their value chain and through what's happening with the operations, but they need to see consistent policies and a clear line of travel forward. Now, by coming to this process and engaging with governments and showing that business wants this, it's one way to add an extra lever into really sending that direction of travel and getting the governments to agree on things in that direction.
Do you sense, and does the We Mean Business Coalition sense that the governments here, or at COPs generally, are actually listening to the business voice, that they're actually internalizing the voice? I mean, there are different kinds of businesses here, some who are not so keen maybe on a climate transition, but those businesses that really want to see this move, do they listen to it? Are they conscious of it? Do they internalize it? Yeah.
Yes. So we represent really the progressive end of businesses. We're a coalition of business organizations who are pushing for that signal for governments to lead the way and provide the strong policy for businesses to act. We do think that governments are listening. We're well connected. We operate here by having meetings with delegations, bringing business speakers in, showing that there is a demand for this, that it makes business sense, that the business wants to see this. However, we always think that there could be more reactivity from governments. In this particular case, we felt that things were slowing down in these negotiations at the end of last week, and we saw an opportunity with the G20 summit happening in parallel. The leaders of the G20 countries were meeting for their Leaders Summit in Rio de Janeiro on the other side of the world on Monday and Tuesday this week. And we then, at the end of last week, teamed up with multi-stakeholders from across Mission 2025 movement to really make a direct business call, saying to the G20 leaders, business is calling on them to galvanize these negotiations, to add that strong signal from the major economies, from the G20 at the highest level of the leaders, to show that call on countries to submit ambitious climate plans with clear, strong policies, and also to come good on making a finance deal that really works for supporting developing countries, and for the private sector allows them to expand their investments into the global south, in the developing world, through bringing down cost of capital and reducing risk. So we organized in a very short space of time this call from business, signed by all the major business groups, got it to the G20 presidency through Brazil, and really made sure that voice was heard in Brazil, and that signal comes back into this process as we move into the final days.
Right. And it does seem to have, it seems that they did listen to this, or at least the G20 leaders on the other side listened to this. I don't know what happened here, but then suddenly, there was seemed to be some movement on one of the main issues for this COP, which is what is going to be the funding that's supplied to the developing world, and again to issue not as charity, but because they're actually doing a lot anyway, and they need in some cases more assistance to further their climate plans, so that the world as a whole can deal with climate change. That's the only way that it can happen. So suddenly something changed in the dynamics, I think, from what you did. Did you get that sense as well?
Yes, I think the signal coming back from G20 was twofold. One was indeed to really push that a strong outcome on this climate finance deal is really expected here, and that this COP has to deliver on that for supporting the global south countries, but also for mobilizing the private capital into those countries. And it's well known now that while clean energy investment is growing very fast internationally, nearly 90% of that, according to the IEA, is going to the OECD countries, essentially the developed countries, and China, and not much more than 10% to the rest of the world. So something really has to change there. So that signal came back from the G20. The other one was around honoring the agreement that countries made last year in the so-called global stocktake, which included this language historically on transitioning away from fossil fuels, and as well as tripling renewables, doubling energy efficiency, accelerating transport electrification, and so on. But the G20 did send that signal back. They didn't explicitly call out fossil fuels, but they did reiterate that countries' NDC should respect the outcome of this global stocktake, which was very hard fought last year. And in fact, the action that we did back then, a year ago in Dubai, was to really bring that business voice on this question of not only the clean energy transition, but that business also wants to see the fossil fuel phase out as part of that transition, but they need governments to help them do that and to get that language out of Dubai. So it's sort of continuum in terms of moving that in the right direction.
It certainly seems on the, you might say, more sensitive issues. For those of us that want climate action, the idea of phasing out fossil fuels or whatever doesn't seem very contentious, but it is contentious for some governments and for obviously some sectors of the economy who have, in a sense, invested in this area of their business, area of their economies. But it seems like there's always a bit of a fight for a while over language, right? It doesn't just get included and it's done. Sometimes people try and slightly unravel it, so you have to be on your toes, right? As an advocacy organisation, and as and use your power to influence the government's decisions. Yeah.
So, no, absolutely, and we have seen some efforts here to roll back this language that was agreed last year, and we stand very well aligned as progressive businesses with, I think, the rest of the civil society movement to say that absolutely that cannot happen. We have to build off this breakthrough we had last year. Rolling it back is not acceptable. And of course, then we need to be accelerating in the right direction. And our message then around how do we accelerate comes back to the plans that countries are putting forward. So it's well known that by next year they need to be all putting forward their new climate plans with their targets and their actions for how they will implement them through to 2035. And this is absolutely critical time, a real opportunity for governments to see this as not just a climate target, but really an investment plan, a means to show the private sector that the policy direction is heading in that direction, and make these plans what we call investable, so that private sector can see that this is really allowing them to go in that direction towards clean investments.
Yes.
And to
absolutely,
make progress.
The private sector wants certainty of direction. They want to know that the governments are committed and invested in this transformation, this halving of emissions, this keeping 1.5 degrees centigrade alive. Last quick question to you, with a really quick answer. Do you think with 5 years to go to halve emissions that the governments are, acting with the urgency they should do in line with the science, or do they need to really up their game?
So they certainly need to up their game. The urgency has been recognised by governments. I mean, they all signed off on the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, with the sixth assessment report, which could not be clearer in the starkness of its warning about how we need to accelerate action and what's happening in the science. So they're aware that the action so far is for the most part not lining up with that. So we do need to see that that step up in acceleration. That said, there are positive signs here. We saw the UK coming out with its new intended climate target for 2035, which is aligned with that net zero 1.5 degrees pathway. We saw Brazil also coming out with its new climate plan, which has a range, but if they push towards the top end of that range, then that could also be a positive step in that direction. But what business needs to see again is now the implementation plan, the details. How will this reflect into policy? The incentive measures, the tax credits, the regulations on the ground. We need to see that the target is super important, but the action plan and the details matter just as much from a business point of view.
It's not just a feel-good factor, but it's actually a reality. Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much. Let's now go to a pre-record. We caught up with Owen Bethel, who is the Global Public Affairs Lead Environment for Nestle. And we caught up with him, and let's hear what he had to say. So I've got another wonderful guest with me here at COP29 in Baku on the Caspian Sea. It's Owen Bethel, who is the Global Public Affairs Lead Environment at Nestle. Lovely to see you, and it's a pleasure. I wanted just to focus a bit on business here, and maybe I suppose my first question to you would be, what is the importance of having business, and positive business, that wants to see a climate transformation? What's their importance here at these COPs?
So I think the starting point for us is the topic of climate change, which of course is a major risk for us as a food business. So we're a global food business with operations in many parts of the world. Parts of the world that are seeing extreme weather events, that are seeing price increases from key commodities and instability, which affects our company. So that's one of the reasons why we want to act on reaching net zero. We want to also invest in projects that increase resilience and adaptation to the weather events that we're seeing. And we're working with many hundreds of thousands of farmers and other suppliers around the world to do that. Now, in order to be successful, we want to see the right enabling policy environment in place. And we value certainty. We value a positive, clear direction from policymakers. So COP is an opportunity to get that message across. And here you've got kind of the biggest gathering of climate policymakers, stakeholders, companies, etc., who are all focused on that objective, or should be. And so that's why I think it's important for us to be here, to communicate that message, and to show that the so-called real economy is actually focused on this, and it wants to work in partnership with government to achieve that.
What's your sense? I mean, do you think the governments listen to this voice, internalize what you need to move further and faster on climate action through better policies, enabling policies? Do you think the governments listen to that, internalize it, and sort of appreciate it?
I think government does appreciate it and welcomes it. I think it gives them some, let's say, space, political space, to go and make these arguments. If they can say business actually supports governments in driving decarbonisation, that maybe pushes back against some of the forces which are less positive about acting on climate, right? Because they can say, well, the real economy that creates jobs and prosperity and wealth actually supports this. So governments do want to hear that. I think they want to work in partnership with business to achieve these objectives, because on their own, governments don't have the resources and they don't have the impact required. So quite often we're the ones doing the projects, we're the ones actually bringing expertise back into government to say, this is what works, this is what doesn't work. Let's get policy focused on the same thing that we're trying to achieve and work together on the same objective.
And as a global player, as a company, I mean, therefore, we're talking about not just the richer countries, not talking just about, say, Switzerland or the UK, but we're also talking about, Africa, Asia, Latin America. So that's important, have you heard anything here at COP29 in terms of announcements so far that you say would be positive for those positive businesses that want to see stepped up climate action?
Yeah, well, I think just in the opening plenary, we heard some positive comments from Simon Steele, UNFCCC General Secretary, about the role of business and the impacts on the economy of not acting on climate. So I think that was welcome, and it's a good signal, let's say, to business to be active and to be open about what they're doing and their objectives. We also heard comments from the General Secretary of the UN, Antonio Guterres, about the need for transparency in climate action by so-called non-state actors, which is basically a euphemism for companies and businesses like ours. And we welcome that. I mean, we think people should be transparent, they should have high ambition on climate, they should be clear about how they do their advocacy and their lobbying around this topic, and all of that for us is a good signal. I think there are specific initiatives as well. Yesterday was Food Day. We had a lot of discussion around the role of farmers and how to create more certainty and clarity for them from all the different initiatives that are going on internationally, because there's many. And sometimes even us, as a global company, we get a bit confused. And so I think streamlining and getting more clarity on where to really focus would be welcome. And we're seeing some positive signals in that direction here in Baku.
I suppose if at the end of this COP there is an agreement to find $1 trillion a year for the developing world, which actually I had the Environment Minister of Madagascar on the show yesterday, I think it was, and they've already worked out that they need about 27 billion a year, and that's just Madagascar. So $1 trillion sounds a lot, but it's maybe not as much as actually all those countries in the developing world really need, but it's maybe a good start. If that happens, is that good for moving forward your climate action program through the lens of food and agriculture? Is that can that help a company like Nestle? I don't know.
I think that is a very positive development in terms of getting more financial flows to developing countries, because actually that's where most of our ingredients come from. So if you think about coffee, you think about cocoa, those come from tropical countries, which are often poorer countries in the global scheme of things. So more money going into agriculture is a welcome development from our perspective, but we're also investing our own money. So we're investing actually around $300 million a year in climate projects, $300 million approximately in climate projects, which actually is not too different to what some countries are investing. And so if you think we're just one company, you could scale up the private financial contribution very significantly in addition to this NCQG discussion, and together that can make a real material difference to progress. Sorry, yes, the NCQG is the famous new collective quantified goal on finance, which is what everybody's talking about here, of course, COP29.
Thanks.
So.
We just had to clear it up for the viewers because they might not know.
For everybody.
I suppose, though, the elephant in the room, the elephant in the room is every time we come to a COP, there's always often some progress of some description that can be observed. But we've 5 years left to halve emissions by 2030, is what the science says we need to do, to have a 50-50 chance of hitting a net zero future in, say, 2050. And that's what the science is arguing that we need to do to have a climate safer world away from the dangers of extreme weather events, etc. Do you as a person maybe sometimes feel a little frustrated that there is this progress, your company's making progress, there will be announcements hopefully this week that will show some progress, but the emissions are still going up and we've got 5 years to go. Do you think that these COPs need to develop a sense of urgency or the emergency brake on the emissions, that it needs to move further and faster now with these 5 years left?
I do. I think that as a global community, we're way off track. There's no sugarcoating it. We should have been declining emissions already, and they need to come down at least 7% per year by 2030 to reach that 50% target, which is unlikely to happen. I think, very unlikely to happen. As a company, we're making good progress. We feel increasingly confident about the direction we're going in, but that's clearly not enough, and we need a whole of economy, whole of society approach. So as an individual, no, I do feel concerned about that. I think the things that work are the solutions which kind of have a life of their own. So if you look at things like the electric vehicle market in China, where there's been a lot of work to set that up, but now it's sort of got a bit of a life of its own, and the sales are increasing very quickly. Same thing on renewable energy, where you've had a business case that's been created which just makes sense. It's just a logical decision to go in that direction. And I think we need to kind of get the same conversation happening and same set of circumstances in place for food and agriculture. So people say, well, regenerative agriculture is the natural choice for a farmer to make because it makes economic sense for them.
Maybe just coming back finally on that question, because I totally agree. And having done some shows, we did a 3-part series with Unilever on this a couple of years ago, and we've had people on since discussing that. It seems like regenerative agriculture is a place where the different even extremities of views on how to produce food can somehow come together in common cause, whether it's organic or intensive here. People can start moving towards this space called regenerative because it's about caring for the soil, isn't it?
Yes.
And so I suppose the other question on that one is, the case is so compelling scientifically, environmentally, economically, for the farmers as well, because they can use less artificial fertilizers, which can be quite expensive, especially if you're in Africa. Why isn't everybody just doing regenerative agriculture now when the case is so absolutely clear?
Well, I think it's still a case building exercise, right? So I think we started ourselves as a company 4 or 5 years ago, really talking about regen ag. It's not a huge amount of time, to really build a case globally for one of the biggest changes in agricultural production that we will see, right? Those things don't happen overnight. I also think it is to be farmer led, and farmers need to feel empowered to do it, so that they have you can't just burden them with a financial cost and say, you must do this because we think it's the right thing for you to do. It needs to be in their control and a project or a process they lead. So we need to get better at that. I also think as an industry, we need to make sure we're all playing at the same level. So people are actually contributing, they're paying premiums, they're investing in projects, they're providing extension services, agronomists on the ground.
And de-risking that 4 or 5 years it takes to move from one system to a regenerative system, yeah?
That's right, yeah, and just capturing what really works and then sharing it and using peer-to-peer networks. There's loads that we need to do to build that up, but it's moving. Yeah.
So if I try and sum that up, I mean, you feel the business case is being heard a little bit better these days than perhaps in the past, that there is something in a COP like this that can support those businesses that want to move further and faster, but that you might agree with me that the urgency needs to be stepped up exponentially if we're going to meet some of the goals that we have to.
I think the urgency needs to be stepped up. I think we need to see leadership as well, leadership from private sector, CEOs and other influencers, which we saw quite a lot of after COP26 in Glasgow, with a lot of initiatives launched there. But I think it's fair to say there has been a bit of a toning down of rhetoric by certain companies around this issue because of various concerns, and the economic situation hasn't helped either, where some people are facing headwinds, etc. But I think we need to sort of separate the two things a little bit and say actually climate action is about building a better business for the future. And we can't stop doing that.
And by inference, a better world.
And absolutely a better world as well.
Owen, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
It's lovely to meet you here at COP29. Thanks very much.
Absolutely. Okay, thank you.
So we'll come to another tremendous guest in a couple of seconds. But first, just going back to Andrew from the We Mean Business Coalition. Any comments on what Owen was saying from Nestle?
Thank you, and it was great to see Owen. I know him well personally, and we as a coalition really know Nestle. They're great supporters of ours, so very aligned with our kind of messages. But they, for example, are a major company, very complex supply chains, internationally influential in many countries, but they were prepared to sign up to our campaign last year on fossil fuels that I mentioned earlier, Fossil to Clean, so really a key signatory to that, just showing that level of ambition and kind of courage in terms of big company. Also very interesting what he mentioned about the alignment of their advocacy activities, which is a really important thing that we work with companies, not so much in this international process, but when they're dealing back at home with governments in the various countries they operate, to make sure that all of their advocacy, all of their lobbying is properly aligned with the climate targets that they've set, and that you don't have part of the business sort of pushing in the wrong direction or lobbying against climate policy. So very clear progress in that by Nestle. And the third interesting thing, given that they are a food-based company with these agriculturally based supply chains, they really do see the climate impacts firsthand. They really see the business risk from climate change hitting their value chains and hitting the people and the farmers involved in the value chains, and they do a lot to react to that and to build that resilience in the value chain. So it's great to see Owen, and we're very much aligned with his messages.
And also that all businesses that want to transition must consistently and not aggressively but pretty loudly speak up at COPs and other places for the kind of progress they want, working through the We Mean Business Coalition or working as their own companies, that we need that business voice to shift governments off their bottoms and get them really mobilized to deliver what we need. So Andrew, stay with us just briefly because we've got another fantastic guest, our third guest, and that's Marie-Claire Graf. She is an award-winning Swiss youth advocate who in the past, if I get this wrong, correct me, but you've been co-chair of the UN Climate Change Processes Youngo Group and many, many other things. And you've also been working on bringing youth negotiators or training youth negotiators to come to the COP to make their voice heard actually within the rooms. And you've witnessed so many things to do with the youth over many, many COPs. So, Anne-Marie, tell me, why is the voice of youth important? It may be so obvious to some, but maybe it's not so obvious to everyone. Why is it important to the COP?
Well, I mean, this is one of the most democratic processes we have in the world when it comes to policies, and it's just silly to not engage young people, right? Especially when we are seeing how stuck we are. I think an intergenerational leadership and renewing the leadership coming here and kind of sharing the responsibility makes a lot of sense. And also by engaging young people, we can bring in new innovation and ideas directly to decision-making tables to kind of bring back the meaning of these processes by connecting them with the people who are facing the local realities, but also the innovators, the practitioners on the ground, because sometimes there's quite a disconnect between the multilateral policies and what needs to happen on the ground. And I think young people are beautiful bridge builders who kind of like bring back these spaces and connect it all together and bring the drive, the action and the accountability what we so desperately need here in the space.
And so the flip side of that is so that's why we need the youth voice. The question is, are governments actually listening to the youth voice and actually acting on the youth voice?
And I think that's why it's so crucial to have young people coming in on multiple levels, right? We have Youngo, as you already mentioned, the official youth constituency, where the observers are gathering. These are the ones who do more of the advocacy. That's why the Youth Negotiators Academy has been training over 300 negotiators from over 60 member states. Actually, 150 of them are here right now in the negotiations, negotiating as part of their member states. Because, you know, young people are also part of the member states. We are rightful citizens of our own country, so why shouldn't we have a voice in a process which represents the member states? And especially, for example, for African countries where we sometimes have 70 or 80% of the population actually is below the age of 35. It's ridiculous to not engage these population in the negotiations, right? And I think by giving them a mandate to actually negotiate, you put them as equals on the table. They can actually engage in the policy process as their own, with their own voice, not through someone else, which gives them a direct access. Right. Nevertheless, I think it's very crucial that we have like a holistic approach on how we're engaging young people, including the young people outside of the process who are also protesting on the streets or even in other countries back home, the journalists, and all of this kind of is a whole ecosystem of change where young people are engaging.
And just to clear this up, I mean, youth is not children, right? These are young adults, many of them as well, right? They're actually working back home and things like that. They're part of the economy often. So actually they're also part of the political structures in a sense, because in Africa, if there are so many young people there, the governments need to listen, because these are going to be the people that vote in the next election, right? So your chance of surviving may be a lot lower if there's a very active climate lobby among the youth in those countries. Have you heard anything at this COP that you feel might be